What's up, good people of the world? Spring break finally arrived, and so I decided to do a video on the Fugue, as many of you have been asking for. So this is a huge topic, as I'm sure all of you know, but I'm really excited about it. Before we get into what constitutes a fugue, I don't want to get a lot into the history of it, but we'll talk just enough, how it arose. I want to talk about counterpoint a little bit, three-part counterpoint specifically. So as you probably remember from my previous counterpoint videos, it's been a while since those have come out. I don't even remember what I said or whether or not I would even, approve of old JJay in the past. But remember that the biggest difference between counterpoint and part writing, there is some correlation between the two, right? We want good voice leading, we want independence of the voices, but besides the fact that for part writing generally tends to have pretty homogeneous rhythm, although you sometimes see Bach chorales that, the rhythms, there are lots of passing tones and auxiliaries and things that make his chorales seem very contrapuntal. The main difference compositionally is that in counterpoint, the linear contour and interest of the line is more important hierarchically than the verticality of the voicing. So there are lots of vertical considerations that are very important in four-part writing that have to do with clarifying the harmony, as well as the fact that since the harmonic rhythm is slower, you are trying to make the vertical voicing as pure and sonorous as possible, which usually means lining up the voicing of the chord with the overtone series. What I mean by that is, in counterpoint, you have the harmonic rhythm is so quick. You could look at a Bach fugue, one measure, you might technically be able to coherently analyze 7 or 8 chords in one measure, right? Whereas in part writing, usually you have, in 4/4, maybe 4 chords at the most per measure, right? So there's a lot of simultaneous activity. In part writing, you generally have consistent harmonic rhythm, and then maybe some of the individual parts have a passing tone here, a neighbor tone here, and a appoggiatura there, but they're not all moving simultaneously like they are in counterpoint. In counterpoint, because we're specifically trying to make the inner lines interesting, which we don't necessarily do in four-part writing, right? Four-part writing, especially like the Lutheran chorales, and especially what Bach wrote, historically, religiously, those were written for the liturgy, right? So they're trying to make the individual lines as singable as possible, and they weren't originally intended for professional musicians, right? The bass line, because of its leapiness, was the hardest line to sing. As you know, if you look at a lot of traditional Lutheran chorales or Bach chorales, the inner lines tend to have as much common tones as possible. Alto lines are often very boring. Tenor lines are often very boring, and you have the melody on top. So you try to have as much oblique motion as possible, and the idea is to not distract from the melody on top. You have a melody, which makes good counterpoint with the bass, and the harmony is very clear, and the melody is not distracted from, right? The melody is clearly at the forefront and on the top of the texture, melody being the top voice, unless you're in a barbershop quartet, in which case the melody is actually the alto voice. But that's a story for another time. So in any case, in counterpoint, what happens is you were trying to make the individual lines as, for lack of a better word, interesting, or rather equal as possible. Equal in the sense of their conspicuousness, right? How salient they are to the texture, right? And the big sacrifice, because everything is not possible in music, the sacrifice that's made is, in order to make the lines more active and interesting, you have to sort of get away with voicing that is not so good. For example, having a doubled third in the chord, right? Or having a voicing that doesn't line up with the overtone series. As you know, the overtone series consists of an octave, a fifth, a fourth, a third. So, approximating. So, you generally want to have voicings like, such as this one right here. If you were to have a C major chord, right, this type of voicing is much better objectively if you want a sonorous sound, just because of the way the overtone series works, as opposed to something like this, right? And you can hear that voicing doesn't sound as sonorous as the other one, right? Because the third that we've doubled in the chord, its overtone series doesn't line up with the sonority that we're trying to build, right? The easiest way to think about the overtone series is just to build a major chord on top of it, right? So we build an E major chord on top of the third, and that doesn't line up. So that's why we don't want to have the third too low. This is something I talk about a lot, because then the overtone series gets into human hearing territory, and it starts affecting the notes above it in a negative way. If you are going for this, purity, sometimes you might want a darkly colored sound with a low third, but that's more of an orchestration thing and a bit irrelevant to here. But in any case, we might have in counterpoint a linear reason. When I say linear, I mean horizontal. A horizontal reason to arrive at a sonority such as this. And the way that it's voiced is not so much to achieve this vertical sense of purity and sonorousness, so much as it might have been better for the tenor to land on the note E melodically, like yada dee da da, whatever the context is. And I'm sure when writing this fugue, this guinea pig fugue, we will run into situations where that will be illustrated. But that's the primary qualitative difference between counterpoint and part writing, is that in counterpoint, the horizontal is, to oversimplify it, the horizontal is more important than the vertical, right? Whereas with for part writing, in terms of the interest of the inner parts, the vertical is more important than the horizontal, right? And this also has to do with the fact that these sonorities are going by so quickly, right? If we were to have a choir hold a chord like this that we've written for an extended period of time, it might become very apparent that it's a muddy voicing, right? Whereas in counterpoint, we might fly by the sonority and just sort of arrive in it, and we're paying more attention to, again, the linear contour of the individual lines. It's like a bunch of melodies superimposed on each other more than necessarily vertical harmony. This isn't to mean to say that the harmony is arbitrary, right? If you're dealing with Renaissance modal counterpoint, that was really before 5-1. There were I shouldn't say remnants because this is before, but there were sort of hints to come of tonality. But really, what they were thinking about, all of their counterpoint rules had nothing to do with functional harmony. It was all about intervals. Even there were actually sonorities in which they measured intervals between the bass and the upper voices, like the altus and the cantus, and the bass, even though there is some dissonance and the functional harmony doesn't make sense. If you have, for example, a sixth and a fifth from the bass, you have a second between the upper two voices, but they didn't actually mind so much because of the fact that they were thinking only intervallically, not about functional harmony. So, in any case, just to give you a bit of background, the point that I'm trying to make there is that nowadays, the thing that Bach did so well and was such a genius and revolutionary in that why people are still studying his works is because he really synthesized the idea of harmony, functional harmony, that has a tonal sense of hierarchy, right? Predominance going to dominance, going to tonic. He synthesized that with this idea of contrapuntal linearity, which is interesting, right? You think counterpoint is so complicated, but it is one of the oldest inventions of mankind when it comes to music, right? Polyphony, Palestrina, back in medieval, we've had polyphony way before functional harmony existed. So, but in any case, okay. Just wanted to kind of give that background a little bit. Okay, so now let's talk about the fugue. Okay, so the fugue is really the culmination of the idea of imitation in music, right? And imitation is also a very old technique that existed in a lot of early medieval music and Renaissance music, and still even today, even jazz. Imitation is just such a widespread idea. Or musical technique. It's not even funny. So, as I'm sure you all know, imitation is where you have some sort of motivic idea that is then imitated or copied or mimicked by another voice, right? This can be, we have different types of imitation, right? You have imitation at the octave, where the imitation is in is down an octave or up an octave from the original subject entry or from the original motive, right? You could also have imitation at the unison. It still has to be in a different voice. So, for example, if you had horns and then cellos imitated the horns at the unison, there has to be enough orchestral difference for you to be able, because if it was just the horn, you can't imitate yourself. So if it was the horns playing a melody and then just repeating it, we would call that repetition. You might be able to make a case for an orchestration if you had a different instrument group, technically a different voice, singing it or repeating the motive at the unison. You might be able to call it imitation. But you also have imitation at the fifth, at the tritone. Basically, at any interval you can imitate. And there are different types of imitation, right? There's tonal imitation and there's real imitation. Real imitation is where you basically just take what you present, this motive, and you repeat it, reiterate it in a different key center, but you retain the mode. So in other words, if I did something like, right? And so then, assuming we're in the key of C major, if I were to transpose this up to F, I would have to make this B a B flat in order for it to be real imitation, right? We're basically just transposing, right? And with a lot of motives, this doesn't require too many alterations of the scale because, as you know, in C major, we basically are just dealing with the modes, right? So, if I create something in Ionian, and then I move it to the fourth degree of the scale, which is basically Lydian, right? I'm going to have to lower that fourth in order to get an Ionian sound. And you make any sort of modal modifications to get this real sounding subject, right? And sometimes it requires more modifications of the scale. So generally speaking, if I were to create some sort of motive, let's say on the same rhythm, if I were to create a Phrygian motive like this, and then I were then to, as we know, the Phrygian mode is a very dark mode on the hierarchy of modes. It's almost the darkest, right above Locrian. So if we were to transpose it to a degree of the scale, maintaining its realness, so to speak, if we were to transpose it to a degree of the scale that normally has a light mode like the Lydian mode, we would have to employ a lot of alterations of the scale, right? I have to go, I'd have to basically change. Let me make these the correct enharmonic spellings. I basically have to change, all of the notes except the first one because changing Lydian to Phrygian requires a lot of change, right? So just something to be aware of. So that's real imitation, right? You could also call it real transposition. So the other thing is tonal transposition, where you basically keep the same intervallic structure in terms of the numbers. If I move up a fourth, I move up a fourth, right? But you don't worry about the qualities of the intervals. So a fourth, if you have a tonal imitation, a perfect fourth may become an augmented fourth, a major third may become a minor third, so on and so forth, right? So if we were to take this motive right here, and this original Phrygian motive that we have, and if we were to employ a tonal imitation on the scale degree F, we're basically just sequencing it. I shouldn't say sequencing. We're basically just transposing it, but we're maintaining the diatonic key center collection. So we have C major, we have the notes of C major. We're not going to use any additional accidentals, right? Right, so that would be what is called a tonal. Okay, a tonal imitation or a tonal modification or a tonal transposition, whatever you want to think about it, whatever fancy words you want to think. Okay, so that's just an important concept to be aware of before we get into the fugue. Okay, so the fugue is based on the idea of imitation. And a lot of people think that fugues are very structured and they're sort of like ironclad, handcuffs that sort of lock you up behind your back and see if you can get out and write a good sounding, quote unquote, piece of music within the confines of a fugue. Besides the exposition, this isn't actually so true. There's a lot of free counterpoint in a fugue. And if you want to see a composer exercising utmost creativity and pathos and a huge, wide variety of modes, of sonorities, of motives, of developments, of length, right? Check out the Well-Tempered Clavier by Bach, right? He's completely limiting himself to the structure of the fugue, following the conventions of the fugue, and pretty much established the Baroque fugue. And yet, there are few collections of music that have more variety and creativity in them than the Well-Tempered Clavier, right? So if you think that the fugue is going to sort of bind you up in structure and force you to sound like everybody else, that's not true. The fugue actually allows for a lot of creativity, right? Really the strictest aspect of the fugue is the exposition, right? And that's assuming that you're going to follow the Baroque rules of exposition. For example, imitating or where the answer, we'll learn about the, subject and answer, but, where the imitation happens up at a fifth. You don't have to have it happen up at a fifth, right? In several of the fugues that I've written, such as my Fugue on the Song of Storms tune, or my Fugue in A major, right, there are a lot of traditions that I sort of, ignore, largely not necessarily because I'm, just rebellious and want to ignore them, but because of the fact that our modern system of harmony, or rather our expanded palette of chords, does not necessitate or require the root fifth motion, right? So, back then, back in the Baroque period, and even early, classicism, and even late classicism, when you were going from one key center to another, well, firstly, you wouldn't have keys like F sharp or, D flat, because the further you got away from C major, because most instruments were largely in just temperament back then, you would get very out of tune the further away you got. And it was also because brass instruments didn't have crooks invented, and wind instruments didn't have certain keys that they have now. Horns were natural horns, so it was very difficult for them to play in keys that had lots of accidentals. So that, in combination of the fact that they didn't have as much chromaticism that they have today, it's easiest for them to move to keys a fifth away, because as you know, on the circle of fifths, that's the least amount of accidentals that we have to change. We move from C to G major, raise the F to F sharp. That's all you have to do. We move from C to F major, lower the B to B flat, right? Besides the fact that it gives us a sense of going away, right? Some people have said to me when I'm teaching counterpoint in private lessons, why don't we go from like C to F major? Why don't we go down a fifth, because C leads to F major? And it's because the first key center that we are in, especially if you're writing in the style, you want it to have a sense of home, and you want to return to home, right? So if you go from C major to G major, G in a large scale sense is the dominant of C, and so it sort of makes you want to come back to C major. So that's why in fugues, the first imitation and this Baroque style that we're going to start with always happens up at the fifth, okay? So let's talk about the structure of the fugue, okay? I'm going to try to... I don't like a lot of the academicism and esotericism that exists in a lot of fugal nomenclatures in theory pedagogy. I think they overdo it with trying to define their terms and trying to, it's overcomplicated. So I'm going to try and simplify things and sort of translate them into kind of, simple lingo, at least what I personally like. But at the same time, I want you to be aware of things, terms like tonal answer or real answer. So if you were to read a book on the subject, or attend a college course, or discuss fugue with, another composer, who's a well-educated composer, that you at least have some sense of the nomenclature and terminology so that you can communicate with them on that basis, okay? So fugues are generally split up into 3 sections, right? And these sections aren't formally divided as much as they are divided by the processes that define them. What I mean by that is simply that, and a lot of theorists and composers have said that the fugue is not really a form so much as it is a process. It is a method by which you can spin out a piece of music. It's a technique, a pattern and basket weaving, so to speak. But it's not like you need to make a basket of this size and shape. It's sort of like you can use this particular technique of weaving to craft patterns in a way that holds together well, but the ending shape of the basket can be whatever you want it to be, okay? So the first part of the fugue that we have is, just like in sonata form, as many of you are familiar with, the exposition, right? The exposition is where we delineate our material. We basically present our primary motif, our melody, and it is then played by all of the individual voices. And this is important. Fugues always are labeled according to the amount of voices that they have, right? This may seem self-evident if you're writing for a little, a string trio or a selection of instruments. Okay, obviously, yes, we have 3 different voices, or 3 different instruments, right? But if you're writing a fugue for piano, it's not necessarily evident. This is why if you were to have, let's say, a 3-voice fugue for piano, and you had a soprano and an alto and a bass, it's very important when your subject initially enters, that there is some sense of which voice is immediately entering, right? So if this is the soprano, right, then we want to make sure that we have a rest in the alto voice when you're notating it, so we know that it's the soprano. If we just had this by itself, you would have no way of knowing until the second or third entry came in whether or not this was the soprano and the alto, right? And some modern editions start off like this, where it's a bit ambiguous. It doesn't tell you whether or not it's the soprano and the alto. And when you introduce a second voice, if it's not obvious enough intervallically that, okay, this one is going up by step and then this other voice enters, sometimes they'll draw a little line, and you see that often in Bach fugues for keyboard instruments, or any fugue really for keyboard instruments, when you have a line switching from the lower half of the top treble staff to the upper half of the bottom bass staff, you'll have a line drawn from one to the other, okay? And it just makes it easy to keep track of the voices. If you were a fugue player, for example, you generally want to bring out the subject whenever it's presented, dynamically. So those little things can help you, because you wouldn't want to go really low in ledger lines in the upper staff or really high in ledger lines in the lower staff. So it, just in terms of readability. But in any case, so fugue subjects. What characterizes a fugue subject? What makes a good fugue subject? Okay, and what makes a good fugue subject is not always what necessarily makes a good melody. I definitely think that you can, if you're careful enough, come up with a subject that is catchy and has tunefulness and is a melody that is whistleable or hummable, so to speak. But at the same time, it functions well as a fugue subject, but they're not necessarily synonymous, okay? So you have to think about, I think, two main aspects of what makes a good subject in order to be able to craft one. One is it going to lend itself to having counterpoint written against it, right? Sometimes, and I'm sure if any of you have studied counterpoint or written counterpoint, you just write a tune or a melody or a motive or whatever, and you try to write counterpoint against it, and just the way that music works, the way that scale degrees work, it just doesn't work out. You just can't get good counterpoint. You can make it work, you can follow the rules, but it just doesn't sound good, right? And then in other cases, you write a melody, and there's a perfect counterline that just seems to emerge from the dream world, so to speak, that happens to just marvelously work, and you marvel at that, and you're like, how this works, so why can't it be this easy all the time? One way in which I think the fugue writer can craft a good contrapuntal structure, because really the climax of the exposition is where you have all three voices going simultaneously. You have the subject, you have a counter subject, and we'll talk about these, and then you have free counterpoint on top. So the moment at which the subject is presented and you have two other counter lines, that's sort of the climactic moment of the exposition. You finally have arrived at three-part counterpoint. And so it's very important that all of those individual lines work together as well as possible. If you start with a subject just for its sheer melodic contour and value, and you're just like, oh, this sounds like a nice melody to me, and then you don't subject it to change, but it's sort of set in stone, and then you try and write counterpoint against it. Let's say you write a second counterline, and then you write a third counterline. Whichever is the last line, the last counter line that you write, is going to sound to be the most contrived, right? Because you are very limited by the time that you get to the third, or, if you were writing a four-voice fugue, getting to the fourth voice, by the time that you add that extra voice, there are only so many things you can do in order to avoid parallels, in order to have good voicing, in order to fill in missing notes of the harmony. And so, because that last melody can sound very contrived, it tends to not have as good horizontal contour. And when a melody doesn't have good horizontal contour in a contrapuntal context, it sounds weak, and it doesn't hold itself up against the other voices well until you lose the equality, right? One of the things that's amazing and brilliant, again, about Bach's contrapuntal ability is the fact that, and I've showed this before in some of my other videos, the fact that at any point in his music, you can pull out one little line by itself, the alto line, the bass line, or the tenor line, or some tiny little, fourth line in the viola that only appears for that one, and it's always a pleasing, good melody with a great contour, and it's catchy and it's singable, right? So, you want to try and make sure all the melodies are a little linearly as interesting as possible, as well as working together vertically. So what's the solution to this problem? It's, of course, thinking ahead, right? Don't start with just a subject and then write, obviously if you're writing a fugue based on an existing melody, then you can't change that existing melody, okay. But if you're writing a fugue, and and you yourself are coming up with the subject, you want to try and weave all three lines of the climax together simultaneously. At least in my opinion, this is what works the best. Because then, if it so happens that the lower line that you're writing, you know, you just hear da-da-dee-dee, da-da-da, you just hear something that you want it to do, so you let your ear guide you and you make it do that thing, and then you adjust the upper two according to it, and then you just sort of like, you do this one and that, and this one, and then you fix that, and then you fix, and you just sort of weave them together bit by bit until you have a structure in which all of the lines sound good individually and they work together vertically. This cannot be done unless you're a genius. This cannot be done if you just start with one melody and then you write the second one and then you write the third one. The last melody that you write is always going to be the most contrived sounding out of all of them, okay? So that's the first part, I think, of writing a good fugal exposition, and writing even a good subject and counter subject is weave the lines together and then sort of break them apart into their constituent parts. The way that they would be presented to the listener. And this really goes for anything in music, you know. If you were writing a big climax for an orchestral piece, right, think about the counter lines that you're going to have. Think about the part writing. Think about, you know, because if you think about, you know, what alto line is going to go with your soprano line and what bass line is going to go with that, and you get all that worked out, you can hint at these things ahead of time. You can play the melody in little bits and pieces. You can hint at the alto line. You can hint at the... And then suddenly when you get to this climax, everything works together, right? It's like Mozart's Jupiter Symphony. You have this 5-part invertible counterpoint, but he doesn't start with the 5-part invertible counterpoint. He starts with all the little strands, and he puts 2 of them together, and 3 of them together, and then 4 of them together, and then 2, and then 3, and finally at the very end, he unveils in 5-part invertible counterpoint in every different permutation the full structure that he composed from the very beginning, right? Do you think Mozart just started with ya-da-dee-da, and then, you know, added another thing, and then added another thing, and then added another thing, and then it just sort of, you know, he came up with that perfect little... He may have very well started with a motive da-da-dee-da, but he worked the counterpoint and wove it together in 5 parts. That was, I guarantee you, that was the first thing that he did, and then composed the symphony, being able to deconstruct that structure, okay? We have the exposition of the fugue, where the subject is presented in the first voice. Usually it's not the soprano and it's not the bass. It can be. There aren't any rules. But the reason is because the last voice that enters has the hardest time being heard orally, and again in terms of how conspicuous it is. Because you already have 2 lines contesting for your attention. So if you add a third one, it's a bit subtle unless you have a really good fugue player like Glenn Gould who can bring out the line, you know, or if you're writing a fugue for different instruments, you can dynamically, or in terms of accent markings, mark up this subject entrance so that it becomes orally conspicuous. But generally, the alto line, you can hear the bass thundering away, especially if it's like an organ pedal. And you can, of course, hear the top line because your ear always generally tends to gravitate towards the top line. But the middle line, right, the alto line, tends to be the most difficult for our ear to hear. And so that's generally why Bach usually, there are many exceptions, but a lot of the time, it's a good idea to start out with the alto voice, especially if you're writing a fugue for piano where there's no textural diversification and it's all the same, you know, timbre. It's a good idea to start with the alto because that's the one that would be hardest to hear. So if you start with that, your ear can hear it, and then the soprano and then the bass, and it's easy to hear the soprano and bass come in because they're on sort of the ends of the spectrum, right? Okay. So yeah, the point that I was trying to make about subjects, you want to try and make a subject so that it lends itself to good counterpoint. And you also want to think about the order in which things happen. One of my pet peeves when listening to fugues is when a fugue has a great subject and it's really catchy and you're like, hey, I like that. And then the counter subject, the second line that comes in is like, it's okay, right? And then the third line is like, that's not so, it sounds kind of forced, right? And again, writing all these simultaneously, you know, you can try and make them all equal, but I think an even better idea than that, at least for me personally, in my subjective opinion, I think your subject in a kind of this is kind of a terse way of putting it, but I think that your subject should be the worst melody, so to speak, in comparison to the other melodies, right? Start out with your, you've written a good subject and it's interesting. And Bach is often like this. You listen to the subject and you're like, yeah, that's okay. It's a little banal. And then the second line comes in and you're like, oh yeah, that's nice. I dig it. And oftentimes the third line is the best line of them all, right? So it can only get better. I think it's better to start with simple, and then add, even better counter lines as opposed to starting with a really good melody and then the counterpoint just gets more and more contrived the more you add voices. Of course, a great fugue should have all three lines should be great, and if you can achieve that, that's great. But again, I think sometimes when you write a three-voice texture, pick the best line out of those and sort of make that your subject. And again, a lot of Bach, some of the most brilliant Bachian fugues, have very simple subjects. Da 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 dee 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 dee. That's not exactly a Mozartian melody that's going to get stuck in your head, but it works wonderfully as a fugue subject in that it lends itself to having counterpoint written against it. And another point to be made is that the simpler the motive is and the less characteristic, the more vanilla, so to speak, that it is, the more it lends itself to many kinds of development, right? Again, think of the Beethoven Fifth, da-da-da-da. It's such a simple little tune, it almost doesn't have any emotional impact. In fact, if you'd never heard that before, you might not even know it's in the key of C minor, right? Because you just hear that da-da-da-da, and it just sounds like, I'm probably not in the right key for you perfect pitch people, but it just sounds like a major third, right? So you might not even know that it's in C minor necessarily. Of course, we've heard the piece before, so we have the sense of this anger, a tempest associated with it. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that because the melody is so simple, he can make it happy, he can make it sad, he can make it, make it tempestuous, make it soft, and so sometimes the simplest motives that don't have a very characteristic sound can lend themselves really well. And that's why if you're trying to write a fugue based off of an existing melody, sometimes the most melodious sounding melody are the hardest to write fugues against because they're so complicated, the notes are so filled in, and they have such a characteristic sound that whenever you sort of modify it to work contrapuntally with what happens around it, first off, the counter lines are never going to sound as good as the melody because it's such a good melody. And secondly, when you try and develop it fuguely like we do with permutation and augmentation and diminution and retrograde and all of these things we're going to talk about later on in the series, it loses a lot of its character. Whereas if you create something simple, it can sort of only get better, right? So I think those are some characteristics of a good fugue subject, okay? So we have the exposition. The first voice delineates the subject, right? And then the second voice comes in with the subject, usually transposed, right? Up a fifth most commonly, but you see other options. And of course, we're gonna get into all this and write it. I'm just kind of overviewing it. And then usually what happens is for the third entry, you return back to the original key, right? And then you either go back to the dominant or the subdominant if you have a fourth entry, okay? And sometimes there's a modulatory bridge section. Usually the first theme, the first subject and the second subject are pretty close to each other, right? Because it's easy to sort of get from the tonic to dominant. But in order to get from dominant back to tonic, there's often a small little bridge. It just functions as a simple modulation to get you back to the home key so that your third subject can enter, okay? After you've presented your subject, and sometimes you have a counter subject, which what you always have counter lines in fugues. Of course, whenever you have counterpoint, you're going to have counter lines. But what defines a counter subject as opposed to just a counter line is the fact that the counter subject recurs. It's sort of a recurring motif. Whereas if only the subject returns, but the counterpoint against it is always free florid counterpoint, you basically are going to change it every single time depending upon the flow of the music. Whereas a counter subject appears usually in tandem with the subject. And one of the ideas of invertible counterpoint, which is very important in fugue, and I didn't really talk about it a lot in my last counterpoint video, one of the things that is so crucial with invertible counterpoint is that you are constructing something that works no matter where you place it, right? When you're dealing with three parts, this isn't as much of an issue, but if you have invertible counterpoint with two parts, it's very important that you are aware of how dissonances invert. So, for example, if you were to have a fifth, which is perfectly consonant in pretty much all styles of music, If you invert a fifth, it becomes a fourth. And in two-part counterpoint, the fourth is a ambiguous dissonance, right? It doesn't quite line up with the overtone series as well as the fifth does. And there are other reasons as well. And so if you have to treat, if you want counterpoint to be invertible in the Baroque style, you have to treat the fifth as if it is a fourth, right? So you treat the fifth like a dissonance and you resolve it to a sixth or, whatever. And we'll talk about resolution of dissonance and we'll get into all these things. I know it's just conceptual right now. But so you have to treat a fifth as if it is a dissonance so that were you to invert the voices and put what was, the lower line on top and put what was the upper line on bottom, which very common happens, the melody switch every combination is very common to switch between all of these three lines. You want to make sure that the counterpoint is written invertibly, right? So that when you invert the fifth to the fourth is handled properly, right? And of course, if you deal with more modern styles of counterpoint, atonal counterpoint, or modern modal counterpoint, sort of like what I did with my A major fugue, you don't necessarily have to be as dogmatic about this. And of course, when you're dealing with three parts, and the Renaissance style, I don't want to get it, this is a bit sidelining, but in the Renaissance style, it was generally considered to be dissonant to have a fourth against the bass no matter where it was present, right? So for example, something like this sonority, you would measure this. You would measure assuming this is a bass, I know it's very high, assuming this is bass, this is alto, this is a soprano, okay, or we'll call this tenor. The lowest voice, we measure the lowest voice with its adjacent voice and with the top voice. We don't measure these intervals together, right, in the Renaissance style, right? So we would look at this fourth and we would say, okay, this fourth is dissonant because there's a fourth, between the bass and one of the middle voices, right? The sixth is, of course, okay. But if we happen to change the chord to be a first inversion chord instead of a second inversion chord, in this case, E minor and first inversion, even though there is a fourth between the upper two voices, we don't worry about that. We only worry about the intervals from the lowest voice to all adjacent voices, right? So we have a sixth and we have a third. So that's totally okay. This is, interestingly, why seven diminished chords, both in Baroque and in the Renaissance style, were perfectly okay if they were in first inversion, right? If I have a root position diminished chord, we have this nasty, I like the sound of it, but for our purposes, currently, this nasty diminished fifth sound, right, this tritone, right, between the top voice and the lowest voice. Whereas if you invert it like this, right, you still have the tritone in the upper two voices, but against the bass, you have two consonances. You have a sixth and you have a third, right? So if you ever hear things, okay, seven diminished seven chords, if you ever taken theory, seven diminished seventh chords are always in first inversion. That's why it's a carryover from the Renaissance, right? In Baroque music, we don't worry so much about that, right? We really employ triple analysis or quadruple analysis if we have three or four voices, in the sense that we measure every voice against every other voice. And in that sense, the fourth is okay as long as it constitutes a triad. Because remember, we didn't have triadic harmony when dealing with Renaissance music. It was all about intervals. You very often had pure sonorities like this, not like that, like this, right, where you don't have a third in the chord, right, because we don't think of tonal harmony. But in Baroque music, we always have tonal harmony. Even in counterpoint, it's triadic harmony, maybe a dominant seventh every now and then, or a dominant a diminished seven chord, right? But generally in triadic harmony, it's okay to have a fourth if it is sweetened by a third, and if the fourth exists in the creation of an inverted triad, right? So this means that while in the Renaissance, really only 1/6 chords were allowed, but not, or I should say, first inversion chords were allowed. We can have root position and first inversion. In the Baroque music and the Baroque style, because of our sense of tonal harmony, it is also okay to have second inversion chords, right? So, and I know, again, all of this is very conceptual, but don't worry, we'll get into actually writing this thing, and I'm going to go through step by step all of the intervals, all of the rules, and I think I was originally going to do another video on three-part counterpoint, talking about three-part florid counterpoint and the different types of dissonances that can be used. But again, every counterpoint textbook does that, and and it's just so hard as a composer to, that helps you sort of study music, but it doesn't really help you know how to apply these rules into actual real world contexts. And if you run into a particular problem, a melody doesn't work out, you're going to break a rule, how do you solve it? I think those types of things are most useful. For me, the most useful way of the most helpful thing that got me better at Counterpoint was just studying these Bach fugues. Again, just going through the World Tempered Clavier and doing an interval analysis of all these fugues and seeing what types of intervals you use. There's a dissonance here. How is it treated? Okay, and you start to just by osmosis, you get a sense of what's possible, what's not possible, and sometimes you often see Bach breaking a rule, and it's very telling and very interesting to figure out, well, why is Bach breaking this rule? And then you see him maybe break the same rule again in a later fugue, and he does it rarely, but both times he broke the rule, he did it for the exact same reason, and so it leads you to a greater conclusion about how music works under the surface level, which is much more internalized and useful to you because you always know why you're doing what you're doing, and you're not just following a checklist of rules, so to speak. Okay, so after the exposition of the fugue, we have what you could call the development, but really it's basically a series of in the interior of the fugue is the most open for creativity, right? It can go by very quickly, or you can just spend so much time developing your material. What you do is you take the subject and you submit it, or subject it, I should say, no pun intended, to various developmental mechanisms, so to speak, right? And you're familiar with a lot of these. Diminution, compressing a melody to make it shorter. Augmentation, making it, I think I talked about this in my melody video. Augmentation, making it longer. Retrograde, which is turning it horizontally backwards. Inversion, which is turning it vertically backwards, or flipping it, so to speak. And there's sequence, and we'll talk about all these. We'll get to these. But so you subject your subject to all of these various permutations. And you have a contrast of what are known as subject entries and episodes, right? So subject entries are basically where you present the subject in its original form, right? It could be augmented, but you generally don't, you want the melody to be recognizably the same that it was in the beginning. It can be a transposition, and perhaps, maybe in some rare cases, an augmentation or a diminution, but generally it's the subject and you're just presenting it, and you have lots of different subjects. So dun 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 ba dum bum 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 ba dum bum 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 bum. It's often imitated in various voices, and these are usually complete statements of the subject. Okay. And sometimes you have this technique, which we'll learn about, called stretto. Stretto is where you have lots of entries of the subject overlapping. So before this entry of the subject even finishes, halfway before it's saying the subject, the subject comes in. And so that's another aspect of developing a good fugal subject. If you want to have your subject be able to be submitted to devices such as stretto, you have to make sure that it works with itself in close proximity, right? So again, the more you learn about the interior of a fugue and what you're going to need to do with your subject, the more you can preemptively design your subject in such a way that it can subject itself to the widest variety of permutations, which makes your job as a composer easier, and it ends up making your piece sound more fluid and natural because it was pre-composed, premeditated, as opposed to just sort of flying by the seat of your pants, writing out a subject off the top of your head, and then just trying with all of your might and intellect and knowledge to make everything work out, in the long run. So you have subject entries, right? And then you have episodes. And episodes it's contrasting material. Sometimes it can consist of permutations of the subject. So you could take the subject and not present it in its entirety, right? One example is the subject from Bach's C minor fugue, right? I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Yada-dum-dum-dum, yada-dum-dum-dum, yada-dum-dum, da-da-da-da-da-da. That's the full subject, right? So he'll take a little bit and turn it into a sequence. Yada-dum-dum-dum, yada-dum-dum-dum, da-da-dum-bum-bum, right? And sometimes split it up like a... turn it into ascending sequence. There are lots of different ways with you can permute it. But because, even though it's still, and Bach tends to be very economical with a lot of his fugues, in the sense that, and this goes for all of his counterpoint, especially the inventions. The first invention in F major is a theoretical It's very, very common to see it in theory textbooks as a method of study for economy of motive, because of the fact that this he takes a little motive and spends an entire piece, and it's very clear that every single bar of that piece is derived in some way from that motive. You don't necessarily have to be economical. I have to kind of force myself to be economical because I tend to kind of get bored easily and want to introduce new pieces of material. But in any case, the point that I want to make is that your episodes may very well contain some part of the subject or counter subject. It's just not a full, complete statement, right? So you have subject entries, which consist of full statements of the subject, which are contrasted by episodic material, right? In episodic material, sometimes it can just be completely new material that is contrasting the subject matter. Or it can be some sort of development of the subject matter. And then you sort of have this, subject entries, episodes, subject entries, episodes, and you sort of go back and forth. And once you've had enough, or your listener has had enough, or you feel as if you've developed, or whatever, if you're writing a symphony, if you want to get back to the recapitulation, whatever the context is, once you feel as if you've had enough, then you arrive at some sort of coda, and right before the coda, or codetta, right, this final cadence, there are lots of common techniques that are used. One is to have a pedal point. This is especially common on the organ, right? That's why a pedal point is called the pedal, because you're holding down the low pedal on the organ and getting this low sustaining. It's usually a dominant pedal, like boom, boom, bum, ba-da-dum, bum, bum. You have this bum, this dominant pedal, which gives you, and you have the voices sort of moving around on top, and then finally the bum, right? So you often have a dominant pedal. You don't have to, but it's a very effective way of signaling, especially in this sort of, like, I shouldn't say mess, but, in this soup of counterpoint, it's very easy to get lost in. You listen to a Bach fugue, and there are very few clear-cut cadences like there are in classical music, periodic phrases. It's just this sort of stream of counterpoint. So having some sense of, like, yes, boom, having a tonic pedal, let us know we're at the end, can be very effective. And I think I did that in both all three of my fugues that are on YouTube, just because I think they're effective for signaling the end. And usually right before the end, not always, but right before the end, you're going to have a final set of subject entries where the subject is presented in its original form in all three voices, right? So you've got the subject, and if you have a counter subject, it's also presented in all three voices. So you've got it in the alto, you've got it in the tenor, you've got it in the bass. So that's a common thing. In the interior, sometimes you might have a tenor and then bass, and then tenor and bass, and then episode, and then the next subject entry, you've got tenor and alto, right? But you usually kind of stave, or at the very least, when you get to the end, you want to present the subject in a sort of final sense. Here's our subject, just to remind you, we're at the end now. You present it in all three voices successively, and oftentimes in the stretto. You can technically use stretto anywhere in a fugue, but it's most common, especially for Bach, to sort of save stretto, because stretto is very climactic. There are a few things like, especially on an organ, hearing a subject that you've intimately familiarized yourself with across the span of the development of this piece, and suddenly hearing it being presented so successively that you can't even process the end of one subject before. It's just such a climactic device that stretto is very commonly used right before codas. And it's also a common thing in fugues, and Bach does this again even in the C minor fugue. You can check this out. He will sort of take this contrapuntal texture and reduce it into triadic harmony, right? So he'll have the individual parts, da-da-dum-dum-dum, and they sort of are separate, and they kind of strand together, and it just sort of morphs into chords, and finally, at the very end, you sort of have this harmonic dum-bum, this harmonic end, which sounds more like four-part writing, or has more of a sense of harmonic closure than necessarily a contrapuntal closure, right? Because you generally want to, because you're going to hear and end on the final sonority for an extended period of time. Usually the last chord is held out. You want it to be well voiced vertically. So normally you have sol do in the bass, sol do, and you have re do, right? Or re mi or fa mi, right? And then you have the leading tone ti do, right? So you end up, in other words, what I'm trying to say is at the very, very end of the fugue, it sort of can morph into part writing to give a sense that all of these arguing lines that don't always agree with each other, if they're kind of working independently, they kind of morph together, become friends, and sort of like agree in a pact at the very end. At least that's how I think about it. Okay. So, next episode we're going to write a fugue subject. Well, what we're going to start with is we're actually going to do what I said, and we're going to write all three voices simultaneously. We'll get into some of the concepts of three-part florid counterpoint in the Baroque style. And then after we do that and we write the exposition, the next video will be on the development, and then finally the coda. And then I'm hoping to write another fugue in a more modern style to show at least how I personally would go about doing that. What rules can be broken in modern counterpoint and why they can be broken, and why you know, those types of things. So yeah, so I know this wasn't a lot of me showing. This was just sort of a preliminary lecture. But I hope you found it interesting, and I hope it can sort of set up contextually, because again, this is a big topic, and books have been written on this. So I would highly recommend checking out Alfred Mann's The History of Fugue. It's a bit pedantic and esoteric and academically written at the beginning, but later on there are lots of great musical examples. And again, grab a copy of the Well-Tempered Clavier. Nothing is going to teach you how to write a fugue better than just studying the ones that Bach wrote. You could also get the Art of Fugue if you want to sort of amp it up a notch. And again, you know, Dover, you can get them on IMSLP for free. Bach is in the public domain, of course. But you could also get this for like $10, and again, just go through and do an interval analysis. That in and of itself can teach you in a clear way. At least for me personally, you know, I retained the rules of counterpoint so much better when I started analyzing Bach's fugues, as opposed to just seeing the rules sort of spelt out in a theory textbook. Because theory textbooks, because they're often written by theorists and not composers most of the time, they don't always explain the reasonings behind things as well as they should. And oftentimes when they do have a reasoning, because they're not in the mindset of a composer, and I'm not bashing theorists, theorists are very, very helpful and very useful to make sense of what a composer often does intuitively. But one thing just last little point here to make, one thing that's important to know about music theorists is that these rules, this Roman numeral analysis, you know, even like the rules of counterpoints, you know, back in the Renaissance, they were not solidified in textbooks by theorists first, and then the composers came along and followed this scientific theory, right? So like the Debussy quote that I put in the melody video, you know, rules do not make works of art make rules, right? And as, you know, romantic as that sounds, it's really quite true. These theorists come along, and especially in four-part writing. Do you know how four-part writing and Roman numeral analysis was solidified? Some very brilliant theorists went through every single one of Bach's chorales, and they saw, what is Bach doing all the time? What is Bach they went through and they saw that Bach hardly ever used parallel fifths, never used parallel octaves, didn't use direct octaves unless there was a skip in the soprano, right? Avoided augmented intervals, and they sort of just by going through and empirically testing and seeing all of these 300 and something chorales, they saw that, okay, Bach wrote a bunch of these chorales, he's a master, they are very singable, we all love how they sound, right? So if you want to write, so really, honestly, when you learn four-part writing from a textbook, it's not how to four-part write, it's how to four-part write like Bach. And of course, Bach was a veritable master, and there's absolutely everything noble about learning how to write like Bach. If you can write anywhere close to the technical mastery that Bach had, you know, then you're in a very good place compositionally. But that's not to say that there aren't other ways of thinking about it that are just as valid as Bach, you know, because again, you know, we have parallel fifths all the time in medieval music, and you know, nowadays we have all kinds of sonorities that would need to have been resolved in the Baroque period that don't need to be resolved today. It's just important that you are consistent with what you do, and that you always understand orally, sonically, you know, why, you know, like when in this context, I hear parallel fifths or parallel octaves, and it sounds wrong to my ears. It sounds cold, it sounds, and you lose the warmth of tonality, the voices are hard to sing individually, you know, and so to my ears, you know, I don't follow parallel fifths just because, you know, that's what they did, but because it just sounds out of place stylistically. But if I'm writing sort of a modern fugue or something, I may still want to avoid parallel fifths in the sense that they take away from, you know, on the macro level, they take away independence. But if I have micro parallel fifths where they're still rhythmically independent, I might be totally okay with that, because in the context of, you know, the piece of the fugue or counterpoint or piece that I've written in this modern style, parallel fifths are okay. But it's important that you are consistent with that, right? So if you're okay with parallel fifths, that's fine, but then don't have one instance in the piece where you use parallel fifths. Because if you don't use parallels your entire piece, and then one little bar comes along and you use parallels, it sounds wrong because it's out of place contextually, right? Whereas if you sort of set up, okay, this my style of counterpoint involves parallels, and it is okay with parallels, and you hear, you know, parallels in 3 or 4 or 5 instances, they're not going to sound wrong because they're accompanied by their brethren, so to speak, in the context of the piece of music. So come up with some sort of logical, coherent, and good sounding, for, you know, it sounds good to your ears, system of thinking, which may or may not be influenced by existing systems of thinking. Sometimes composers are innovative like Debussy and develop their own systems, you know, which, you know, they took a large variety of influences like gamelan music and pentatonic Chinese music, and along with functional harmony of the Romantic period in Western music. And you can develop your own style. It's just important that your style is coherent, that you can defend the reasons why you do the things that you do, and that you are consistent with them, because then things aren't going to sound wrong, because you have created a style and you're being consistent for it. And you're being consistent not blindly, but because for very specific aural sonic reasons, right? Because it sounds good ultimately. And good, in that sense, is subjective. Really, sounds good wouldn't be the best way of putting it. It would be better to say it sounds aesthetically like what you were trying to communicate, right? Which may, if you're writing battle music, may be dark and dissonant, right? You know, if you write this dark and dissonant music in a horror movie and you have lots of dissonances and you use set theory to ensure that you only use tritones and tritones and half steps and dissonances, if you suddenly accidentally come to a major chord, a major triad, that's going to sound just as wrong as an improperly resolved dissonance is going to in the Baroque period, right? So, in any case, thank you so much for watching this video. I know it's a long one, and I know it's just me talking, but I promise you the next video we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and we'll start writing. And as always, any questions about anything, please ask me in the comments, and I will try to get to those as soon as possible. Yeah, and thank you so much for your support on Patreon. I really appreciate all of you people that are patrons. That makes a huge difference. All of that money goes directly towards an equipment fund that is devoted to me trying to make my videos better quality. And like I've said, you know, before in recent videos, over the summer I have a lot of videos in the works. I'm gonna try really amp up the production value. And I also just started doing this thing called Patreon Lens, right? Which is where I post, if you are a patron, you only have to be a $1 patron, just $1 a month. And you get access to a bunch of behind-the-scenes videos of me composing, showing pieces that I'm working on, of piano improvisation, you know, jazz band, all just very candid behind-the-scenes stuff that would probably be a little bit too candid for YouTube, short little snippets. If you're interested in that, you know, I would really appreciate your patronage. And if you're unable to be a patron, just your subscription and your likes. And your comments and helpful feedback, you know, constructively critical or otherwise, I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I will see you all in the next video. Adios.